blood. Inside Rome, people could walk the streets at night without fear. Something extraordinary for the ancient world. Merchants sold olive oil from Spain, spices from the East, and Egyptian grain that fed millions. It felt like stability, even luxury. Yet, for every peaceful market day, there were wars raging somewhere else. Rebellions in Judea, uprisings in Germania, and campaigns in Bithynia. In short, the empire's machine never stopped grinding. Soldiers endured freezing winters, scorching summers, and countless deaths, so the Senate could boast of calm. Peace, in Rome, was not the absence of war, it was the silencing of enemies. The emperors knew the value of appearances. Statues of Augustus and his successors portrayed them as bringers of harmony. Coins bore slogans like Pax and Victoria to remind citizens that Rome thrived under their rule, but propaganda hid the truth. Peace was fragile. Borderlands simmered with unrest. Entire villages vanished in punitive campaigns designed to scare others into obedience. 2. The Romans. This was a fair trade sacrifice. A few secure, the many. The empire spawned violence into virtue, reshaping conquest into the noble act of spreading civilization. 2. The conquered. Though it felt like chains dressed as order for the common Roman. Pax Romana brought a rhythm of life rarely seen before. Farmers tilled their land without fear of raids. Travelers crossed vast distances with protection, and cities thrived with games, theaters, and baths. Life seemed good, yet the safety came from Rome's harsh methods. Pirates were hunted down and crucified, rebels executed in public squares, and entire populations deported for defiance. The promise of stability was kept by terror. People rarely questioned it because the alternative, chaos and lawlessness, was worse. Pax Romana wasn't just peace. It was carefully maintained fear dressed as stability on the empire's edges. However, the story was different. In Germania, fierce tribes resisted Roman expansion, ambushing legions in forests where Roman order failed to reach. In Bithynia, uprisings, led by leaders like Boudica, drenched Roman soil with blood. These were not forgotten battles. They were the hidden costs of peace. Rome crushed its enemies ruthlessly, burning villages, enslaving survivors, and building forts to keep order. The empire's heartland could boast of calm only because its soldiers endured unending war at the frontiers. Peace inside came from constant violence outside, a cycle Rome never admitted openly. The Colosseum, one of Rome's grandest icons, symbolized more than entertainment. Gladiator fights weren't just games, they were political theater. Emperors used the blood of slaves and prisoners to distract citizens, reminding them of Rome's power. Crowds cheered while men fought for survival. And in that roar, the empire's message echoed, "Defy us, and this is your fate." Peace thrived because fear thrived. By normalizing death as spectacle, Rome numbed its citizens to violence. They could enjoy tranquility in their homes because brutality was ritualized in the arena. Pax Romana was written in the sand and blood of arenas. Trade routes became lifelines of the empire, and their safety was Rome's proudest achievement. Caravans could cross deserts, and ships sailed seas once dominated by pirates. This freedom wasn't natural. It was enforced. Legions built roads through mountains and deserts, marching thousands of miles to ensure commerce flowed. But every peaceful transaction masked battles fought elsewhere. Merchants enjoyed profits while soldiers froze on northern frontiers or died in forgotten ambushes. Rome loved to present trade as proof of harmony. Yet trade survived only because of military dominance. The empire's economy thrived, but the bill was always blood. Roman propaganda was relentless. The poets, historians, and politicians of the empire echoed the same theme. Rome brought peace, order, and civilization. They painted conquered peoples as savages, saved by Roman law. In reality, these so-called savages often had their own rich traditions, destroyed to make way for Roman dominance. The empire's peace was not shared equally. Romans dined in marble halls while prisoners built aqueducts with broken backs. The narrative of harmony was powerful because it convinced citizens they lived in a just world, yet for millions under Rome's shadow, peace felt like oppression. Punishments were brutal because Rome wanted deterrence, not fairness. Rebels weren't simply executed, they were crucified on roads as warnings. Whole families could be enslaved for a single act of defiance. Cities that resisted saw their walls torn down and their citizens scattered as slaves across the empire. These acts kept Rome's order intact. People complied not because they believed in Rome's justice, but because the cost of resistance was unbearable. Pax Romana thrived on this logic. Create fear so deep that even whispers of rebellion died in throats. It worked, but at a terrible moral price. At its core, Pax Romana was a paradox. For citizens of Rome, it was a golden age of culture, architecture, and safety. For outsiders, it was submission, violence, and loss. The empire packaged war as peace and conquest as civilization. It was stability achieved through dominance, prosperity, bought with pain, and glory, overshadowed by cruelty, and yet history remembers it as Rome's greatest achievement. Perhaps that's the most telling part. The victors always write the story. Pax Romana wasn't just 2 centuries of peace, it was 2 centuries of silence, enforced by the sword. Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, was the architect of Pax Romana. After decades of civil war, he understood that stability required both power and illusion. He reformed the army, secured borders, and presented himself as a fatherly figure. Citizens saw him as the man who ended chaos. But Augustus also mastered propaganda. He commissioned poets like Virgil to sing Rome's glory, casting himself as the chosen leader destined to guide humanity. People believed in his image, forgetting that it was Augustus who ruthlessly eliminated rivals. Peace began not with kindness, but with calculated control. The brilliance of Pax Romana was in how it disguised fear as security. Romans believed they were protected by divine favor, but in truth, they were protected by discipline. Emperors ensured loyalty through bread and circuses, feeding the poor and dazzling them with spectacles. Citizens cheered in the arenas, their minds distracted from the empire's constant wars. They traded freedom of thought for comfort, and Rome liked it that way. Peace lasted because the people accepted entertainment and grain in exchange for silence. Their lives were predictable, but only because they were carefully managed from above. The legions were the backbone of Pax Romana, a professional force unmatched in the ancient world. Soldiers built roads, guarded borders, and spread Roman law wherever they marched. Their discipline created the empire's stability, but it also chained them to endless conflict. A legionnaire might spend decades stationed far from home, fighting rebellions or patrolling frozen rivers. His sacrifices meant Rome's citizens could live in calm cities, sipping wine and debating philosophy. The soldier's peace was different from the citizen's peace. It was endless marching, endless waiting, and the knowledge that death was always one ambush away. Life in the provinces revealed the dual nature of Roman peace. Some cities flourished under Roman rule, gaining access to trade networks, aqueducts, and protection from raiders. Local elites often embraced Rome, adopting Latin and building temples to the emperor. Yet others felt the crushing weight of occupation. Taxes were heavy, conscription loomed, and resistance was met with brutality. In Judea, resentment sparked repeated revolts, crushed with devastating force. Rome's peace was a gift only if you submitted. Refuse, and peace vanished in flames. For provincials, Pax Romana was a gambled prosperity for some, despaired for many others. The Roman economy thrived during these centuries, but not without shadows. Wealthy elites controlled vast estates, while peasants worked as tenants or laborers. Grain from Egypt and North Africa kept the population of Rome fed, but it also created dependency. Any disruption could trigger riots. Slavery remained the foundation of labor, and millions toiled unseen to maintain the empire's comfort. While senators debated in marble halls, slaves carried the empire on their backs. Peace meant stability for the rich, but exhaustion for the poor. Pax Romana promised prosperity, but prosperity was never shared equally across society. Cultural achievements blossomed during Pax Romana, giving the empire an aura of greatness. Roman art, architecture, and literature flourished, leaving behind works still admired today. Roads and aqueducts symbolized innovation and cities grew into marvels of engineering. Yet, even these cultural gifts were built upon conquest. Marble came from quarries worked by prisoners. Colossal monuments stood on foundations of sweat and blood. Rome's legacy was glorious, but the glory masked suffering. Every arch that celebrated peace was paid for by unseen lives. Pax Romana gifted culture to history but charged a price the oppressed could never afford. The emperors who followed Augustus inherited both his system and his burden. Some maintained order with wisdom, others with cruelty. Tiberius ruled with suspicion, retreating into isolation. Caligula turned peace into madness, his reign marked by paranoia and violence. Claudius expanded the empire, while Nero became infamous for excess. Pax Romana survived these rulers because the system was bigger than any man. The empire's bureaucracy, legions, and economy kept the machine running even when emperors faltered. But each ruler's flaws chipped at the illusion of harmony, reminding people that even peace could be fragile. Outside Rome, resentment simmered. In Britannia, the rebellion led by Queen Boudica exposed the thin line between order and chaos. Her warriors burned Roman towns, slaughtered citizens, and nearly expelled the legions. Rome crushed her uprising, but the scars remained. In Judea, resistance turned into open war, ending with Jerusalem's destruction and the temple's fall. These uprisings proved that Rome's peace was fragile, fought by relentless retaliation. The empire projected strength, but unrest never fully died. Pax Romana worked best in Rome's heart, where propaganda was strongest. But at its edges, fire always smoldered. Religion also played a role in maintaining control. Emperors demanded loyalty not just politically, but spiritually. The imperial cult spread across the provinces, where citizens were expected to worship the emperor as divine. Temples rose in his honor, blending politics with faith. This system strengthened loyalty, but it also bred tension. For communities with strong traditions, like the Jews and later Christians, worshipping the emperor was impossible. Refusal meant persecution. Pax Romana demanded conformity even in belief. Harmony was promised, but only if every citizen bowed to Rome's vision of unity under the emperor's shadow. The cost of Pax Romana stretched across generations. Children grew up in calm cities, unaware that their safety rested on endless campaigns fought far away. Families enjoyed theater, baths, and festivals, while legions bled in silence. Rome's storytellers crafted myths of glory, convincing citizens their world was stable by destiny. Few questioned the truth. Peace was never destiny, but design. It was engineered by fear, propaganda, and war. Rome bought 2 centuries of calm, but the bill was written in graves across continents. Pax Romana was not simply historite, was the empire's most polished illusion. The Roman legions at the empire's frontiers were the silent guardians of Pax Romana. Far from the marble temples of Rome, soldiers endured bitter winters, scorching deserts, and endless patrols. Their presence kept the provinces in line, reminding subjects peoples that rebellion would bring swift punishment. For them, peace meant standing watch on cold ramparts, scanning forests and rivers for signs of danger. While citizens in Rome enjoyed comfort and safety, the legions lived in constant readiness. Their lives were consumed by duty, but their sacrifices created the stability emperors boasted about in grand speeches. Daily life in Rome's capital was a world apart. Citizens strolled through forums, shopped in bustling markets, and attended performances in theaters. Bread was distributed to the poor, and games distracted the restless masses. It seemed like the pinnacle of civilization. Yet this comfort existed because the empire extracted wealth from its provinces. Grain ships from Egypt, taxes from Gaul, and tribute from the east poured into the capital, feeding the city's hunger. Rome glittered because others were drained. Pax Romana at home was golden, but only because distant lands paid the true cost of its shine. In the countryside, farmers benefited from stability but faced their own struggles. With roads secured and markets open, they could sell produce across provinces. But taxation was relentless. Collectors demanded tribute, and those unable to pay lost land or freedom. Many small farmers became tenants on estates owned by the wealthy elite. They lived under Rome's peace, but it was peace defined by obligation and debt. For some, it meant opportunity. For others, a slow decline into poverty. The empire called this harmony, but two peasants bound by debt. It felt more like captivity wrapped in routine. For the elites, Pax Romana was a golden age of influence. Senators, generals, and wealthy landowners grew richer as the empire expanded. They hosted banquets in villas, decorated with mosaics and statues, symbols of Rome's glory. Their fortunes depended on the stability of the empire, so they supported the system wholeheartedly. They praised emperors, funded temples, and sponsored games to maintain public favor. To them, peace was profitable, but even elites knew that power existed only because the emperor allowed it. Their loyalty was built not on choice, but on the understanding that Rome's peace was fragile and conditional. Art and architecture flourished under Pax Romana, giving the empire lasting symbols of greatness. Cities were adorned with aqueducts, amphitheaters, and triumphal arches celebrating victories. These monuments impressed both Romans and foreigners, projecting power and stability, yet they also served as propaganda. Every stone whispered Rome's message: "We bring civilization to conquered peoples." However, these monuments were reminders of defeat. A new road or aqueduct might improve life, but it also symbolized submission. The beauty of Rome's creations was undeniable, but it stood on the ruins of independence. Pax Romana gifted art but erased countless voices along the way. The Roman legal system became another pillar of peace. Laws were standardized, courts established, and disputes settled with consistency across provinces. This gave the empire a sense of fairness, drawing admiration even from conquered peoples. Merchants trusted contracts, cities relied on written codes, and ordinary citizens felt some protection under Roman law. Yet, justice was not equal. Elites often escaped punishment, while the poor bore the harshest penalties. Slaves had virtually no rights at all. The law gave an appearance of order, but its foundation was hierarchy. Pax Romana used law as both shield and chain, balancing fairness with control. In religion, Rome allowed diversity, but demanded loyalty to the state. Temples to local gods stood beside shrines to Jupiter, Mars, and Venus. This tolerance gave the impression of freedom, but when religion clashed with imperial authority, tolerance vanished. The Jews in Judea and later Christians refused emperor worship, sparking persecution. For most, worshipping the emperor was symbolic, but for these groups, it was impossible. The empire saw their defiance as rebellion. Peace required unity. Even in fight, Rome called it harmony, but to those targeted, Pax Romana was a cage that demanded submission in every aspect of life. The myth of Pax Romana grew stronger with every generation. Children born during these centuries knew only stability, believing it was Rome's natural gift. They studied history rewritten by poets and teachers who praised emperors as guardians of peace. This narrative was powerful. It convinced citizens that their world was exceptional, ordained by fate. But history was selective. Rebellions, massacres, and oppression were silenced in the official record. The empire engineered memory itself. People forgot the blood spilled to create their calm lives. Pax Romana was not just a system of governance, it was a story carefully crafted to endure. For the conquered, life under Rome was a constant negotiation. Some embraced Roman rule, gaining wealth and status by serving the empire. Others resisted quietly, preserving languages, customs, and traditions under the surface. Outwardly they obeyed, but resentment simmered. When revolts broke out, they were crushed mercilessly. Rome rewarded loyalty but punished dissent with brutality. To some, Pax Romana brought opportunity. To others, it meant living in the shadow of fear. Peace under Rome was not universal, it was fractured, offering prosperity to a few while demanding silence and submission from the many. Looking back, Pax Romana is celebrated as one of history's longest eras of stability. Historians marvel at the roads, trade, and cultural achievements it allowed, yet the deeper truth remains. Peace was selective, prosperity uneven, and harmony built on conquest. The phrase, itself Roman peace, was propaganda, a brand for domination disguised as benevolence. For 2 centuries, Rome mastered the art of presenting control as calm, The world remembers the glory, but often forgets the blood beneath it. Pax Romana was not a miracle. It was an empire's masterpiece in turning war into the illusion of eternal peace. The emperors of Pax Romana understood that peace was as much a performance as it was a policy. They staged grand parades, triumphs, and ceremonies to display Rome's power and reassure its citizens. Victoria's generals marched through streets lined with cheering crowds, dragging captives and treasures from foreign lands. These spectacles told the people that Rome was invincible, that their lives were safe because the empire ruled the world. Yet behind the gold and marble, the truth was simpler. The empire's peace was constantly maintained by fear, loyalty bought with bread, and the constant shadow of war. At the heart of Pax Romana was the idea of Roman superiority. Citizens believed they were chosen to bring order to the world, a belief reinforced by art, education, and religion. Children were taught that Rome's laws were just, its culture refined, and its power unshakable. This sense of destiny gave citizens pride, but it also blinded them to the suffering of others. Conquered peoples were labeled barbarians, their voices drowned out in Rome's narrative of civilization. The peace Rome celebrated was not universal, it was one-sided, seen only through the eyes of those who benefited. The Roman economy thrived, but it also became dependent on constant expansion. New provinces meant new taxes, new resources, and new slaves to fuel the empire's machine. As long as Rome conquered, it grew stronger, but when expansion slowed, cracks began to appear. The costs of maintaining legions across vast territories weighed heavily. The empire disguised these strains with propaganda, but the truth was clear. Peace was expensive. The illusion of stability depended on endless conquest, and without it, the carefully balanced system began to falter. Pax Romana was secure, but it was never unbreakable. In Rome's provinces, the memory of conquest lingered. Villages remembered when legions marched through their lands, burning fields and enslaving families. Even decades later, the scars remained. Some communities adapted, blending Roman customs with their own, while others clung to tradition in quiet defiance. To Rome, this was peace. Subdued populations producing taxes and tribute. To the conquered, it was survival. They endured the empire's rule, often resentful but powerless. Pax Romana looked like unity on a map, but on the ground it was patchwork, a mosaic of cooperation, resentment, and silent resistance beneath Rome's heavy hand. The arenas and amphitheaters of Rome were more than entertainment. They were tools of control. Gladiators fought to the death, chariots raced, and wild beasts roared before crowds of thousands. These spectacles kept citizens occupied and distracted, giving them a sense of pride in their empire's grandeur. Yet every performance was a reminder of Rome's power. Defeated enemies fought as slaves, their deaths paraded as entertainment. The message was clear. Rome conquered, Rome ruled, and Rome's peace was permanent. Citizens left the arenas cheering, convinced of stability, while the empire quietly tightened its grip on their imaginations. Roman roads became the veins of Pax Romana, carrying soldiers, merchants, and messages across continents. Built with precision and durability, they symbolized the empire's order. A trivella could move from one end of the empire to another with safety unheard of before. Rome. But the roads were also military tools. Legions used them to crush uprisings quickly, moving across provinces with frightening speed. What felt like freedom for traders was surveillance for rebels. The same roads that carried prosperity also carried conquest. They were marvels of engineering, but they were also chains, binding the provinces to Rome's rule. The empire's taxation system revealed the price of peace. Citizens in Rome enjoyed bread, games, and aqueducts, but these luxuries were funded by the province. Tax collectors squeezed peasants and farmers, demanding grain, money, or labor. Those who failed to pay lost their land of freedom. Entire regions carried the weight of the empire's capital, feeding the beast that never rested. To Roman elites, taxes were proof of order. To those who paid, they were constant reminders of submission. Pax Romana was not simply about keeping peace, it was about ensuring wealth flowed endlessly toward the empire's heart. Education during Pax Romana reinforced the empire's values. Children learned Latin, Roman history, and the greatness of their leaders. Stories of conquest were told as tales of destiny, shaping young minds to believe Rome was eternal. Philosophy, law, and literature flourished, but they also served the empire's narrative. Schools created citizens loyal to Rome, thinkers who justified its power, and poets who glorified its peace. Knowledge was celebrated, but it was carefully curated. Pax Romana was as much about controlling ideas as it was about controlling lands. The empire mastered minds just as surely as it mastered borders. Religion became a unifying tool, blending local gods with Roman deities to create harmony. Citizens were allowed to keep their traditions, as long as they acknowledged the emperor's divinity. This compromise worked for many, but not all. For monotheistic groups, the demand was impossible. Their defiance turned religion into rebellion, and Rome responded with persecution. Pax Romana demanded outward conformity. Even if faith suffered, temples stood tall as symbols of unity, but beneath them lay a truth the empire refused to admit. Harmony built on force was fragile. The empire tolerated difference only until it threatened control. At its peak, Pax Romana seemed eternal. Citizens marveled at their cities, enjoyed their luxuries, and trusted their emperors. To live in Rome during this time was to believe you were part of destiny. Yet history teaches us that every empire has cracks. Beneath the surface of harmony, inequalities widened, resentments deepened, and the costs of maintaining order grew heavier. Peace was real, but it was not absolute. It was maintained by constant vigilance, endless sacrifice, and unyielding control. The empire's golden age was brilliant, but it was also fragile, a masterpiece balanced on the edge of a sword. The Roman Senate during Pax Romana became more ceremonial than powerful. Once a strong political body, it was reduced to a stage where elites echoed the emperor's will. Senators debated, but real decisions were made in the palace. This shift revealed the truth: a Roman Senate wasn't democracy, it was control. Citizens were told their voices mattered, yet their lives were guided by imperial decrees. Still, many accepted the illusion because it brought stability. The Senate's marble halls symbolized tradition, but behind the polished speeches lay silence. The peace crafted not by choice, but by obedience. Military veterans were another key piece of Pax Romana. After decades of service, soldiers were rewarded with land or pensions, tying their loyalty to the empire. Colonies of veterans settled in newly conquered regions, spreading Roman culture and securing territory. These communities helped Romanize provinces, blending military discipline with civilian life. Yet veterans often struggled. Their bodies carried scars, and their minds held memories of endless battles. They enjoyed the empire's peace, but they knew its price more than anyone. Their settlements symbolized Rome's strength, but also the sacrifices hidden beneath the empire's calm surface. The role of women during Pax Romana reflected both progress and limitation. In wealthy families, women managed estates, influenced politics indirectly, and participated in cultural life. Some, like Livia, the wife of Augustus, wielded considerable power behind the throne. For ordinary women, life was harder. They worked in markets, raised children, and endured limited rights. Still, stability gave them some security: safer streets, access to public baths, and the chance to prosper if their families rose in status. Pax Romana improved lives in small ways, but freedom was reserved for men. Peace for women was structured by duty, not autonomy. Slavery remained the dark foundation of Rome's peace. Millions of enslaved people worked the fields, built aqueducts, and served in households. Their labor fueled the economy, allowing citizens to enjoy luxuries without toil. Pax Romana celebrated harmony, but it rested on forced labor and human suffering. Rebellions were crushed with ruthless efficiency, ensuring slaves remained silent. Some found ways to gain freedom, but most lived and died in bondage. The empire's peace depended on their submission, a truth rarely spoken in Roman propaganda. To call it peace was misleading. It was stability built on chains and control. Roman cities flourished as centers of culture, trade, and governance. Streets bustled with merchants selling goods from across the empire. From silk to spices, public baths offered relaxation, and amphitheaters provided entertainment. Life in these cities seemed like proof of Rome's greatness, yet behind the urban prosperity was inequality. Elites lived in spacious villas with mosaics and gardens, while the poor crowded into cramped cells, vulnerable to fire and disease. The empire ensured cities thrived, but it cared less for the people at the bottom. Pax Romana created shining cities, but they were divided worlds of luxury and struggle. Rome's peace also relied on engineering. Aqueducts carried fresh water for miles, supplying cities with baths, fountains, and sanitation. Roads, bridges, and harbors connected distant lands. These marvels impressed both Romans and foreigners, showing the empire's genius. But engineering also served control. Roads moved legions, aqueducts supplied garrisons, and infrastructure reinforced Roman dominance. Citizens' sole comfort, but emperors' sole strategy. Every project was both gift and chain, offering prosperity while securing obedience. Pax Romana's brilliance was not only in conquering, but in building. Yet the foundations were never neutral. They were designed to ensure Rome's peace endured by force. Education under Pax Romana produced loyal citizens and ambitious elites. Boys studied rhetoric, philosophy, and law, preparing for roles in politics or administration. Literature flourished, with writers like Seneca and Pliny shaping thought. But education was also a tool of indoctrination. Students learned Rome's greatness as fact, its conquest as destiny. Alternative stories were erased, ensuring future generations believed in the empire's narrative. Knowledge was power, and Rome controlled both. Pax Romana appeared enlightened, but it was selective. Citizens learned to question philosophy, yet never the empire itself. Peace was preserved by shaping minds, as much as by shaping borders. The army's presence in every province ensured. Pax Romana endured. Fortresses dotted the landscape, symbols of Rome's strength. Soldiers weren't just warriors. They built roads, guided trade, and enforced law. Their discipline reassured allies and intimidated enemies. But constant militarization came at a cost. Provinces lived under watch, their lives shaped by the shadow of legions. Peace came not from trust, but from fear. Rome called it security, but many saw it as occupation. The empire thrived because its sword never rested. Pax Romana was a shield for some and a blade for others. Depending on perspective, entertainment was Rome's most subtle weapon of peace. Chariot races, gladiator games, and theatrical performances distracted the masses from politics. The phrase bread and circuses captured the empire's strategy. Feed the people, entertain them, and they will not rebel. These spectacles celebrated Roman power, while dulling unrest. Citizens cheered, forgetting taxes, wars, and inequality. Pax Romana thrived not only on discipline but on distraction. The empire knew that as long as citizens were entertained, they would accept the illusion of harmony. Peace endured, not because it was fair, but because it was carefully staged for the crowd. The provinces experienced Pax Romana differently depending on their relationship with Rome. Some regions prospered, becoming wealthy trading hubs integrated into the empire. Others resisted, suffering harsh punishments until they complied. Local leaders who cooperated with Rome were rewarded, while those who defied it were erased from history. For many, survival meant compromise, adopting Roman customs while keeping traditions alive in secret. This dual existence defined provincial life. Peace was conditional, and loyalty was transactional. Pax Romana created order, but it was uneven. To some, it felt like progress. To others, it was submission disguised as stability. The image of the emperor became the anchor of Pax Romana. Statues stood in every city. Coins carried his face, and temples honored his name. Citizens who had never seen Rome itself still felt the emperor's presence in their daily lives. This created unity, but also dependency. Peace seemed tied to the emperor's strength, and instability followed weak rulers. While Augustus crafted this image carefully, his successors inherited both power and burden. The emperor was the face of peace, but he was also a reminder that stability rested on one man's ability to command both loyalty and fear. Foreign policy during Pax Romana balanced diplomacy with intimidation. Rome signed treaties, established client kingdoms, and rewarded allies. But the shadow of the legions always loomed. Neighbors knew cooperation was safer than resistance. This dual strategy expanded influence without constant war. But it relied on Rome's reputation for brutality. One revolt crushed, one city burned, and the message spread quickly. Defy Rome, and destruction follows. Peace extended beyond the borders not because Rome was loved, but because it was feared. The empire's diplomacy was less about friendship and more about ensuring silence on its terms. Rebellions still flared, despite Rome's dominance, showing that Pax Romana was never absolute. In provinces like Judea, resentment boiled over into full-scale uprisings. These revolts were brutally suppressed, often leaving cities destroyed and populations scattered. Rome documented these victories as proof of strength. But the truth was more complex. Every rebellion revealed cracks in the empire's illusion of harmony. The need for constant suppression showed that peace was conditional, fragile, and costly. For every festival in Rome, celebrating victory, there were ashes smoldering in some faraway province where people had resisted Rome's rule. The role of religion during this time cannot be understated. While traditional Roman gods maintained their place, the empire absorbed foreign deities into its pantheon, creating a sense of inclusivity. This blending allowed conquered peoples to see parts of their culture reflected in Rome, softening resistance. Yet the imperial cult worship of the emperor meant non-negotiable. Refusing it was seen as treason. For many polytheists, it was tolerable. For monotheistic faiths, it was intolerable. Pax Romana demanded conformity, not faith. Religion became both a bridge and a weapon, sustaining peace through compromise while punishing those who could not bend. The peace of Rome shaped identity across its empire. People in distant lands began to see themselves as Romans, adopting Latin, wearing Roman clothes, and sending their children to Roman schools. Citizenship spread over time, granting legal rights and prestige. This assimilation created loyalty, but it also eroded local traditions. Generations later, people who once resisted Rome proudly called themselves Romans. Pax Romana succeeded in part because it transformed enemies into citizens. Yet this success was double. The more Rome absorbed, the more it diluted cultural diversity, turning vibrant histories into echoes of the empire's singular voice. Trade networks during Pax Romana turned the Mediterranean into what Romans called Marina Rc. Goods flowed from one corner of the empire to another one. Olive oil, grain, silk, spices, and precious metals. This connectivity enriched cities and sustained the empire's economy. Merchants thrived, markets flourished, and wealth accumulated in Rome. But trade depended on the empire's might. Pirates were executed, smugglers punished, and roads patrolled by soldiers. Peace made trade possible, but trade also justified Rome's strict control. Empire commerce was not just wealth, it was proof that Pax Romana was working as designed. Life for ordinary citizens reflected the contradictions of Pax Romana. They enjoyed safer streets, access to public baths, and food in the markets. But poverty persisted. Many lived in cramped apartments, vulnerable to collapse. While fires swept through neighborhoods, their lives were stable but harsh, softened only by Rome's promise of bread and circuses. They believed in the empire's greatness because it shielded them from chaos. Still, their peace was fragile. A failed harvest, a corrupt official, or sudden war could shatter stability overnight. Pax Romana gave ordinary people hope, but never true equality or lasting security. Rome's justice system played a central role in maintaining peace. Laws were written and enforced across the empire, giving a sense of order. Courts settled disputes, and punishments discouraged crime. This consistency impressed many conquered peoples, who saw Roman law as more reliable than tribal justice. Yet the system was tilted. Wealth and status often bought leniency, while the poor faced harsher penalties. Justice was a tool of control, not fairness. Still, it worked. People accepted the empire's peace because it seemed orderly. Even when biased, Pax Romana endured because it created the appearance of justice that citizens trusted. Architecture during Pax Romana projected power and permanence. Cities gleamed with temples, amphitheaters, and forums that symbolized Rome's greatness. These structures were not just functional, they were propaganda carved in stone. Arches celebrated victories, columns honored emperors, and arenas reminded people of Rome's reach. For citizens, these monuments inspired pride. For the conquered, they were constant reminders of defeat. The empire used architecture to shape how people thought, turning every building into a message. Rome is eternal. Rome is dominant. Rome brings peace. Pax Romana wasn't only maintained on the battlefield, it was etched into the very landscapes of cities. The greatest paradox of Pax Romana was its dependence on violence. Peace was praised in speeches, celebrated in art, and worshipped in temples. But it was enforced by fear. Every rebellion crushed, every slave revolt silenced, and every province subdued revealed the empire's true foundation. Citizens in Rome lived as if their world was secure, but the security was an illusion built on the suffering of others. Pax Romana was peace for some and oppression for many. Its brilliance lay in convincing generations to believe the story. Even as blood soaked the soil beneath the empire's grand facade, the Pax Romana reshaped warfare itself. Instead of constant civil wars, Rome focused its violence outward, toward rebellions and borders. This allowed the interior of the empire to thrive. While legions bled on distant frontiers, battles became less about Rome's survival and more about maintaining dominance. Citizens could almost forget war existed, except for the triumphs that paraded through the streets. For the soldier, though, peace was endless preparation, patrol, and sacrifice. Pax Romana did not end. War had relocated it, placing the burden on the margins so the empire's core could live in comfort. Propaganda turned emperors into symbols of divine order. Augustus styled himself as a savior who restored peace after chaos, while later, emperors adopted similar imagery. Statues portrayed them calm and commanding, as if the empire's harmony flowed directly from their rule. Citizens saw their emperors as the embodiment of stability, a living guarantee that Rome's destiny would endure. Yet emperors were human, often flawed, and their mistakes could unravel the illusion. Pax Romana demanded not only discipline from the people but also a constant performance of power from the throne. Without it, cracks in the story appeared quickly. Cultural blending became one of the most lasting effects of Pax Romana. Greek philosophy merged with Roman practicality. Eastern religions found homes in Roman cities, and local traditions mixed with imperial customs. This cultural fusion enriched art, literature, and daily life, making the empire vibrant and diverse. Yet it was not always voluntary. Local traditions sometimes survived only in secret, hidden from officials who pushed Roman norms. Peace encouraged exchange, but it also demanded conformity. The empire absorbed much from the world, but it always insisted the world bow first. Pax Romana thrived on diversity. Reshaped to serve Rome, Roman citizenship became one of the most powerful tools of control. At first, it was a privilege for elites, but gradually it spread to wider groups. Citizenship meant legal protection, rights in court, and prestige. Granting it to local leaders secured loyalty, tying their futures to the empire. By the time of Caracalla, nearly all free men in the empire were citizens, a move that unified the population but also increased tax revenue. Citizenship created pride, but it also blurred identities. People called themselves Romans, even as they remembered older traditions. Living in the balance between privilege and loss, the family unit was central to life. Under Pax Romana, fathers held legal authority, mothers managed households, and children were raised with discipline to respect tradition and Rome's order. Families mirrored the empire itself, hierarchical, disciplined, and bound by duty. Peace allowed families to plan for the future, invest in land, educate their children. Yet, era inequality lingered. Wealthy families thrived, while poor ones struggled to survive in cramped housing and with limited resources. Pax Romana gave stability to family life, but it didn't erase hardship. The empire's peace made some lives easier, while leaving others barely above survival. Artistic expression celebrated Rome's prosperity while hiding its violence. Frescoes depicted banquets, gardens, and mythological scenes, projecting an image of leisure and beauty. Sculptors carved emperors as flawless, immortal figures, These works suggested a world of harmony, a society free of strife, yet few artists dared to show the darker truths of war, slavery, or oppression. Art became part of the illusion, a way to convince citizens that their world was as perfect as the marble statues around them. Pax Romana wasn't just political, it was aesthetic, wrapping brutality and beauty so thoroughly that people believed in the illusion. The role of philosophy during Pax Romana highlighted the tension between reality and idealism. Thinkers like Seneca and Epictetus explored stoicism, teaching endurance, self-control, and acceptance of fate. These ideas resonated with people living under an empire where control was centralized and personal freedom limited. Philosophy gave citizens tools to endure, framing obedience as virtue. While it provided comfort, it also conveniently aligned with Rome's needs. A population that accepted hardship without rebellion, Pax Romana benefited not only from legions and propaganda, but from philosophies that taught people to live peacefully within their limits. The empire's peace also changed how people saw time. Generations were born, raised, and died within the same system, knowing nothing but Rome's order. To them, Pax Romana felt eternal, as if it had always been and would always be. This illusion of permanence was one of the empire's greatest strengths. Few imagined a world without Rome, because everything in their lives, laws, markets, even festivals, depended on Italian. Stability created complacency, and complacency made people less likely to resist. Pax Romana succeeded partly because people forgot how fragile peace truly was. The empire's communication systems reinforced this illusion of permanence. Messages carried along roads and relays reached distant provinces quickly, allowing emperors to project authority across vast lands. News of victories, decrees, and laws spread with remarkable efficiency, giving people the sense that Rome's hand was everywhere. This control of information created unity, but it also filtered truth. Citizens heard about triumphs, not defeats. They learned of harmony, not unrest. Communication didn't just connect the emperor, it shaped its narrative. Pax Romana endured in part because people believed the version of reality Rome wanted them to see. For all its stability, Pax Romana left behind contradictions. It gave the world centuries of relative calm, fostering culture, trade, and progress. Yet it achieved this through conquest, fear, and inequality. Its legacy is both inspiring and unsettling. Historians still debate whether Pax Romana should be celebrated as a golden age or condemned as an empire's illusion. Perhaps the truth lies in both. It was peace, yes, but peace paid in blood, silence, and submission. The story of Pax Romana is less about harmony and more about how far an empire will go to make control look like destiny. The Roman army's discipline became a legend during Pax Romana. Soldiers trained relentlessly, drilled daily, and lived by strict codes that made them more machine than man. This relentless order turned the legions into the backbone of peace. Rebellions didn't last long because Rome's response was swift, coordinated, and merciless. Two ordinary citizens. The legions symbolized safety. Two conquered peoples. They symbolized domination. The same red-crested helmets that reassured a Roman farmer on the road struck terror into villages on the frontier. Peace was in force, not by goodwill, but by the rhythm of marching boots. Infrastructure built during Pax Romana transformed the empire into a connected world. Roads stretched across mountains. Aqueducts carried water for miles, and bridges spanned rivers once considered barriers for citizens. These achievements meant convenience and prosperity. For Rome, they were strategic lifelines that allowed armies to move quickly and resources to flow steadily. Every stone laid was both a gift and a reminder of control. The beauty of Roman engineering was undeniable, but its purpose was never purely civic. Pax Romana was built in marble and stone, but its foundations were always military and political. Entertainment in Rome remained essential to maintaining calm. Crowds filled the Colosseum. Chariot races thrilled thousands in the Circus Maximus, and Theata echoed with stories of gods and heroes. These events weren't just pastimes, they were safety valves. By distracting people with spectacle, Rome avoided unrest. The phrase bread and circuses wasn't just a saying, it was policy. The empire ensured citizens were fed and entertained so they wouldn't question the system. Pax Romana endured, partly because people accepted the trait. Give us food, give us games, and we'll forget the darker truths. Hidden behind the curtains of the stage, the spread of Latin unified the empire's identity. From Spain to Syria, people learned the language of Rome, using it in markets, courts, and schools. Latin became the glue of Pax Romana, allowing communication across diverse lands. Yet while Latin spread, local languages faded, often pushed into the shadows. This linguistic dominance created cohesion but erased heritage. To Rome, it was progress. To those who lost their mother tongues, it was silence. Pax Romana didn't just conquer land, it conquered voices, replacing them with one language that symbolized the empire's demand for unity under its banner. Roman taxation, though often oppressive, helped sustain the illusion of prosperity. Money funded public works, military campaigns, and the spectacles that kept the masses content. Citizens in Rome saw fountains, theaters, and clean water as signs of peace. But these luxuries came from the sweat of provinces far away. Farmers bent under heavy burdens, villages gave up grain, and rebellions were sparked by tax collectors. Greed, Pax Romana's comfort, wasn't shared equally. It was extracted from the edges to maintain the core. Peace glittered in Rome, but the sparkle was paid for in countless invisible sacrifices. The role of merchants under Pax Romana highlighted both opportunity and dependence. Trade routes were safer than ever, and goods from across the known world flowed freely. Merchants became wealthy, cities flourished, and the empire's economy thrived. But this prosperity was fragile. A single war on the frontier or disruption in grain shipments could trigger unrest. Merchants relied entirely on Rome's power to protect them, and without it, their livelihoods crumbled. Pax Romana gave them prosperity, but it was prosperity chained to the stability of an empire, always on guard against collapse. Religion continued to evolve during this period, absorbing gods from conquered lands. The cult of Isis spread from Egypt. Mithraism from the east found followers among soldiers, and traditional Roman deities blended with new traditions. This diversity made the empire vibrant, but it also created tension. The more Rome allowed, the more it had to control. Religion became a balancing act. Too much freedom threatened loyalty. Too much restriction caused unrest. Pax Romana wasn't true harmony. It was a delicate juggling of beliefs under the ever-watchful eye of emperors who demanded ultimate devotion. The prosperity of cities like Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch became the pride of the empire. These urban centers bustled with culture, scholarship, and commerce, embodying the promise of Pax Romana. Yet outside their walls, rural poverty persisted. The empire showcased its glittering cities as symbols of progress, but they were islands of wealth and a sea of struggle. For many, peace didn't mean prosperity, it meant survival, paying taxes, and enduring hardship. The empire's golden age looked radiant from the top, but at ground level, it was often harsh, demanding, and unrelenting. Pax Romana was prosperity for some, endurance for most. The Roman legal system, admired even centuries later, gave Pax Romana a sense of legitimacy. Laws were codified, disputes resolved, and contracts enforced. For many, this created trust in the empire's order. Merchants felt secure, citizens felt protected, and even some conquered peoples saw benefits. But law was also a tool of control. It upheld hierarchy, protected the powerful, and punished defiance harshly. Justice was predictable, but it was not equal. The empire wrapped control in the language of fairness, convincing people that obedience was rational. Pax Romana thrived not because it was just, but because it seemed unshakably orderly. Looking across history, Pax Romana stands as both achievement and contradiction. It delivered to centuries of stability, culture, and innovation unmatched in the ancient world. Yet it did so through conquest, fear, and inequality. Rome crafted peace like an artist crafts a statue polished on the surface, but filled with cracks inside. To celebrate Pax Romana is to admire the beauty of stability while remembering the cost. It was a peace that reshaped the world, but one that came at a price written in blood, silence, and submission. Its legacy endures because it tells us the eternal story of powers, illusions, The frontiers of the empire were where Pax Romana revealed its sharpest edge. In Germania, Dacia and Britannia soldiers lived in constant tension, building forts and watching restless tribes. To the heart of the empire, these places seemed distant and barbaric, but to the legions stationed there, they were reminders that peace was always fragile. Pax Romana wasn't a blanket covering all of Rome. It was a wall, constantly guarded, constantly tested. Every sunrise on the frontier was proof that peace in Rome existed only because others lived under the shadow of watchtowers and swords. The expansion of Roman citizenship during this era further cemented loyalty by offering conquered peoples the chance to become Roman. The empire transformed outsiders into insiders. With rights, privileges, and protection came obligations to Rome. The system blurred lines between conqueror and conquered, creating unity while extending control. Yet the promise of citizenship was also a leash. It tied elites in the provinces to the empire's fortunes, making rebellion less tempting. Pax Romana endured because Rome learned that identity could be as powerful as force. Becoming Roman was both opportunity and surrender. Urban planning under Pax Romana showcased the empire's vision of order. Cities were laid out with precision forums at the center, streets and grids, aqueducts, supplying water, and amphitheaters, entertaining the masses. This uniformity created a sense of Roman identity across distant lands. A city in Gaul looked familiar to a traveler from Spain or Asia Minor. But this design was more than aesthetic. It was control. Standardized cities reflected standardized rule. Pax Romana turned geography into propaganda, reminding citizens and provincials alike that no matter where they were under Rome's unshakable order. The role of trade guilds and associations flourished during Pax Romana. Craftsmen, merchants, and laborers organized into groups that provided support, regulation, and stability. These guilds thrived because Rome guaranteed peace along trade routes and within cities. They contributed to the economy, strengthened communities, and ensured skills were passed down. Yet they also tied people more tightly to the empire's system. Membership meant stability, but it also meant dependence on Roman order. Pax Romana wasn't just enforced by legions, it was embedded in the daily lives of bakers, builders, and traders who prospered only under Rome's umbrella. The arts under Pax Romana celebrated Rome's grandeur while subtly reinforcing control. Poets praised emperors, historians glorified victories, and sculptors immortalized Roman ideals. Even literature that criticized society, like satire, operated within boundaries, never openly challenging the system. These works enriched culture, but also perpetuated the empire's narrative. The world admired Rome's creativity, but creativity was shaped by politics. Pax Romana gave artists freedom, but it was a freedom that served Rome's image. Every poem, every statue, every arch was part of the story of stability, reminding people that Rome's peace was as cultural as it was military. The economic system that thrived during Pax Romana rested on slavery, agriculture, and trade. Large estates worked by slaves produced grain, olives, and wine, feeding the empire. Trade routes connected provinces, while taxes funded Rome's monumental projects. The system created abundance, but it was also brittle. Any disruption in supply lines or harvests threatened the balance. Pax Romana's prosperity was real, but it was also precarious. Citizens enjoyed markets full of goods, but behind every loaf of bread lay chains, sweat, and vulnerability. The empire's peace was strong, but never as invincible as propaganda claimed. Philosophy during Pax Romana offered a way for individuals to find peace in an empire built on power. Stoicism taught acceptance and endurance, while Epicureanism focused on moderation and inner happiness. These ideas resonated with citizens seeking calm in a world where their choices were limited. Philosophy became a survival tool, encouraging people to adapt rather than resist. For Rome, this was convenient. A society that endured quietly was easier to govern. Pax Romana benefited not only from soldiers and taxes, but from philosophies that made submission feel like wisdom. Peace wasn't just enforced, it was taught as virtue. The balance between Rome and its provinces was delicate. Some prospered under Roman roads, laws, and protection, while others simmered with resentment. Governors managed these lands, sometimes fairly, often corruptly. A good governor brought prosperity. A corrupt one triggered unrest. Pax Romana depended heavily on competence at every level of rule, yet Rome's bureaucracy was vast, and cracks always appeared. The empire's peace seemed eternal from the capital, but in the provinces, it was a daily negotiation between cooperation and coercion. The story of Pax Romana was not uniform, it shifted depending on where you stood. Roman religion became increasingly complex during this era. Traditional rituals continued, but new cults and foreign gods found space in the empire's spiritual marketplace. Mystery religions promised personal salvation, offering comfort in ways traditional rites did not. Christianity, still small, began spreading quietly, offering an alternative vision of peace, not tied to Rome's power. These movements highlighted a truth. Pax Romana could control roads, armies, and cities, but it couldn't control the human need for meaning. Peace in the body didn't always mean peace in the soul, and Rome's system couldn't silence that hunger forever. As Pax Romana entered its later years, cracks began to show. Successors to Augustus often lacked his vision or discipline. Corruption crept into administration, and economic strains grew heavier. Legions remained strong, but the costs of maintaining them drained resources. Citizens still enjoyed stability, but discontent quietly spread. The Golden Age hadn't ended, but its shine dulled. The illusion of eternal peace wavered. Pax Romana had given the world much, but the seeds of decline were already planted. The empire's greatest achievement was also its greatest burden, sustaining harmony that was never truly effortless. The late years of Pax Romana carried both pride and unease. Rome had built an empire of roads, cities, and laws that stretched across continents. Two citizens in the capital, it felt eternal, an achievement unmatched in history. But whispers of unrest traveled along those same roads. Provinces grew restless, borders strained, and emperors faltered. The promise of endless harmony began to feel more like a fragile mask than a reality carved in stone. The peace that had once seemed invincible now trembled under the weight of its own contradictions. The cost of sustaining Pax Romana became clearer with time. Resources were stretched thin, taxation grew heavier, and the burden of maintaining legions consumed wealth. Citizens who once celebrated Rome's glory began to question the sacrifices demanded. For provinces, the strain was sharper. Rebellions simmered as resentment. Deep, the empire had promised peace, but many saw only obligation. Stability endured, but it was no longer golden. It was enforced, brittle, and fading. Pax Romana had reached its peak, and decline loomed just beyond the horizon. The memory of Rome's golden age, however, would outlive its decline. Writers, poets, and historians preserved the story of Pax Romana as a time of greatness. Generations later, people still looked back at those 2 centuries as a model of stability and order. The narrative survived even when the reality had crumbled. That was Rome's genius. Not only to build power, but to craft a story so compelling it outlived the empire itself. Pax Romana became less of a reality and more of a legend, etched permanently into the imagination of history. Citizens who had grown up during the Golden Age found it difficult to imagine a different world. They had been raised with stories of Rome's invincibility, surrounded by monuments that celebrated its glory. When cracks appeared, many refused to see them, clinging to the myth of stability. This denial delayed reform and blinded leaders to growing problems. Pax Romana had trained generations to believe peace was permanent, but in reality, it was always conditional. The greatest illusion of the age was not stabiliet, was the belief that stabiliet required no constant sacrifice. Even as decline set in, the infrastructure of Pax Romana endured. Roads continued to connect distant lands. Aqueducts still carried water, and laws maintained a sense of order. These achievements became Rome as a true legacy. While peace faded, the systems built during those centuries left lasting imprints on the world. Later civilizations would borrow Roman ideas of governance, engineering, and law. Pax Romana ended as an era, but its bones remained, shaping societies for centuries. Its spirit lived on, not in eternal peace, but in the structures it left behind. The contradictions of Pax Romana became lessons for future generations. It proved that peace can be engineered, but only at great cost. It showed that stability requires constant vigilance, not just ideals, and it reminded the world that empires often rewrite their violence as harmony. The name itself, Roman Pius, was brilliant propaganda, turning domination into destiny. Yet its legacy also showed the possibilities of long stability, where culture and trade could flourish. Pax Romana was both warning and inspiration, a reminder that peace is never simple and always comes with a price. The people who lived through Pax Romana experienced both privilege and pain. For some, it was the best time in human history, filled with prosperity, safety, and cultural achievement. For others, it was oppression disguised as order, their freedom stripped away under the name of stability. This duality is what makes Pax Romana so fascinating. It was neither wholly golden nor entirely dark. It was human, filled with ambition, sacrifice, and contradiction. That complexity is why its story still echoes centuries later, long after the empire itself has vanished. In the centuries after its end, Pax Romana became a benchmark for leaders and dreamers. Kings, emperors, and even modern nations have looked back at Rome's golden age as proof that long peace is possible. Yet many forget the cost. They remember the glory, but not the blood. They admire the stability, but ignore the chains. History has a way of polishing the past until only the shine remains. Pax Romana shines brightest in memory, where the shadows of suffering are easier to forget, but the truth lingers beneath the marble, waiting for those willing to see it. For historians, Pax Romana remains a puzzle. Was it truly peace? Or was it simply a pause between storms? Was it a model of order or an empire's illusion? The answer may lie somewhere in between. What is certain is that Pax Romana was extraordinary into centuries where the world's greatest empire crafted stability unlike anything before. Its achievements inspire, its contradictions disturb, and its legacy endures. In Studianite, we see both the best and worst of human ambition, the brilliance of order, and the shadow of domination. The story of Pax Romana ends where it began, with blood. The peace that defined Rome for 200 years was built on conquest, sustained by force, and remembered through propaganda. Citizens called it harmony, emperors called it destiny, and historians call it golden. But beneath every marble arch and polished statue lay untold sacrifices. Pax Romana gave the world roads, laws, and culture, but it also demanded silence, submission, and blood. In the end, it was not eternal. It was another remarkable one that proved peace is never free, and harmony always carries a hidden cost.